Blood stained the cobblestones of the great hall, but it wasn't from a battle. It was the scent of a shattered bond. When Lord Cedric threw Genevieve into the dirt, branding her a barren runt before the entire kingdom, they laughed. They didn't know the Alpha King was watching. The year was 1422, and the winter wind howling through the parapets of Somerset Keep carried the bitter promise of ice and isolation. Inside the great hall, however, the air was thick, suffocating beneath the heavy scents of roasted boar, spiced mead, and the feral, unmistakable musk of 400 shifting wolves. This was the mating ball, a brutal and ancient medieval tradition where political alliances were forged in blood and moonlight, and where the weak were systematically culled from the noble lines. Genevieve Hastings stood in the shadows of the archway, her fingers trembling as they gripped the coarse velvet of her midnight blue gown. At 20 years old, she was a ghost in her own home. Once, she had been the proud daughter of Lord Arthur Hastings, the warden of the Eastern Marches. But Arthur had fallen in the skirmishes of the Blood Rifts 3 years prior, leaving Genevieve entirely at the mercy of her cruel uncle, Baron Godfrey, and a society that valued only teeth, claws, and the ability to breed strong warriors. Genevieve possessed none of these. She was an anomaly, a tragedy whispered about in the courtyard and snickered over by the hearth. By the age of 16, every wolf in the kingdom experienced their first shift, a bone-breaking rite of passage that tied their human consciousness to their inner beast. Genevieve had never shifted. Her eyes remained a soft human hazel, entirely devoid of the luminescent gold or piercing amber that marked her kind. To the pack, she was dormant, a runt, a genetic dead end whose very existence was an insult to the moon goddess. Tonight was supposed to be her salvation. A contract signed by her late father bound her to Lord Cedric Ashbourne, the arrogant and fiercely ambitious heir to the wealthiest earldom in the southern valleys. Cedric was a prime alpha, standing at 6'3" with shoulders broad enough to carry a kingdom's weight and eyes like chipped flint. He was ruthless, calculating, and he despised her. "Stand up straight, you wretched girl," hissed Lady Evelyn, her cousin, giving Genevieve a sharp shove between the shoulder blades. Evelyn's golden eyes flashed with cruel amusement. "Try to look like a lady of the court, even if you possess the blood of a crippled dog. Lord Cedric is waiting." Genevieve swallowed the bile rising in her throat, forcing her chin up. The massive oak doors swung open, and she was thrust into the blinding light of 1,000 tallow candles. The great hall fell into a hushed, predatory silence as she made her way down the aisle of fresh rushes. High lords and ladies, adorned in furs and jewels, lined the walls. She could feel their eyes raking over her, smelling her lack of a wolf. They looked at her not as a noblewoman, but as a piece of spoiled meat. At the far end of the hall, standing upon the raised stone dais beneath the banners of the Ashbourne clan, stood Cedric. He did not look like a man preparing to greet his future mate. He stood with his arms crossed over his leather tunic, his jaw clenched, his expression radiating pure, unadulterated disgust. Beside him stood the High Cleric Reginald, holding the ceremonial silver binding cord. Genevieve's soft leather slippers made no sound as she climbed the 3 stone steps to the dais. She bowed her head, exposing her neck in a submissive gesture meant to honor her intended alpha. "Lord Cedric," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling hearth. Cedric did not offer his hand. He did not speak the traditional words of acceptance. Instead, he stepped forward, the heavy scent of his dominant pine and smoke aura crashing over her like a physical blow, designed to force her to her knees. Genevieve's human body groaned under the unnatural pressure, but she locked her joints, refusing to fall. Cedric's lip curled into a sneer. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming off the vaulted stone ceiling. "Lords and ladies of the Southern Valleys, I stand before you tonight bound by a contract forged in a bygone era, by men who are now dust." He paced the length of the dais, his flint-gray eyes scanning the room. The Hastings line was once proud. But look at what stands before me. Look at the bride I am expected to bind to my soul, to carry the future of the Ashbourne legacy. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. "Cedric, please," she whispered, a desperate plea not for love, but for basic dignity. He ignored her, snatching the silver binding cord from High Cleric Reginald's trembling hands. "She is 20 years old, and she has never shifted. She has no wolf. She has no strength. She is a dormant, barren runt. To mate with her would be to poison my bloodline. It would be an insult to our ancestors." Gasps rippled through the hall. Lady Beatrice, the notorious gossip of the Western Pax, covered her mouth, though her eyes danced with malicious glee. Baron Godfrey, Genevieve's uncle, stood in the front row, looking entirely unfazed, having likely orchestrated this public spectacle to finally rid himself of his niece. "By the old laws of Ethelgard," Cedric roared, his fangs elongating as his alpha blood surged. "I, Cedric of House Ashbourne, declare this contract void. I reject Genevieve Hastings as my mate. I brand her unworthy." Before Genevieve could process the absolute ruin of those words, Cedric moved with terrifying lupine speed. He grabbed the collar of her velvet dress and violently ripped it downward. The heavy fabric tore with a sickening screech, exposing her collarbone and the delicate, unblemished skin of her left shoulder. He didn't stop there. From his belt, Cedric drew a hunting dagger not to kill, but to humiliate. With a brutal, precise flick of his wrist, he sliced through the thick braid of her dark hair, severing the traditional maiden's knot. The heavy locks fell to the dirty stone floor like dead weight. He pushed her hard in the chest. Genevieve stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the dais. She fell hard, crashing into the dirt and rushes of the lower floor. Pain blossomed in her hip and elbow, but it was nothing compared to the agony of the rejection. Even without a wolf, the severed mate bond felt like a phantom limb being torn from its socket. She gasped for air, clutching her torn bodice to her chest, her dark hair falling in a jagged, uneven mess around her pale face. The hall erupted, not with pity, but with laughter. "Unworthy!" someone shouted from the back. "Cast the runt to the winter woods," another jeered. Genevieve knelt in the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was ruined. A rejected, unshifted female in the medieval pack system had only two fates: to be sold as a nameless scullery maid to a rival pack, or to be driven into the wild to freeze to death. Cedric stood above her on the dais, chest heaving, looking down at her as if he had just scraped her from the bottom of his boot. She lowered her head, closing her eyes, waiting for the guards to drag her away. But the guards never came. The raucous laughter in the great hall died so abruptly, it was as if all oxygen had been instantly sucked from the room. Genevieve, still clutching her torn dress in the dirt, felt it first. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure, a terrifying, crushing, monolithic weight that slammed into the room, driving every wolf in the hall to their knees. It was an aura so ancient and violently dominant that the very stone walls of Somerset Keep seemed to tremble. The temperature in the hall plummeted. The flames of the tallow candles flickered violently, turning from warm orange to a cold, unnatural blue. At the far end of the hall, the massive, iron-reinforced oak doors did not just open, they were blasted inward, the heavy iron hinges groaning in protest. Through the threshold stepped a nightmare of legend, flanked by 12 towering royal guards clad in blackened steel armor. King Alistair Redford, the Alpha King of the United Realms, the Wolf of the North. For a decade, Alistair had ruled from the frozen capital of Oakhaven. He was a warlord who had conquered the splintered factions of their kind, uniting them under a banner of blood and absolute terrifying law. He was the last living descendant of the royal direwolves, a lineage thought to be touched by the gods themselves. Rumors painted him as a monster, a king who hadn't taken a queen because no female could survive the overwhelming brutality of his aura, a man who executed treasonous lords with his bare hands. He was not supposed to be here. The king rarely left the north, and never unannounced. Genevieve peeked through her jagged hair, her breath catching in her throat. Alistair was devastating to look upon. He stood an imposing 6'5", wrapped in a massive cloak of midnight wolf fur that dragged against the stone. He wore no crown, only a simple band of dark iron forged around his brow. His face was a landscape of harsh, aristocratic angles, marred by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to a strong, stubbled jaw. But it was his eyes that froze the soul. They were a striking, luminescent ice blue, glowing with a barely contained inner violence in the dim hall. Behind him, Sir Thomas of Kent, the captain of the Royal Guard, stepped forward and slammed the butt of his halberd against the floor. The sound cracked like thunder. "Kneel before your king," Sir Thomas roared. Not a single soul in the room needed the command. The high lords and ladies, who mere moments ago had been laughing at Genevieve's ruin, threw themselves prostrate onto the floor. Baron Godfrey pressed his face so hard against the cold stone it looked as if he were trying to merge with it. On the dais, Cedric Ashbourne's arrogant facade shattered. His knees buckled, and he dropped heavily to the stone, bowing his head in sheer biological submission. Only Genevieve remained exactly as she was already broken, already in the dirt. But strangely, while the heavy alpha aura was suffocating the mighty wolves around her, making them gag and whimper in submission, Genevieve felt a bizarre, thrumming warmth radiating through her veins. The crushing pressure in the air didn't hurt her, it enveloped her. King Alistair began to walk. His heavy steel-toed boots echoed rhythmically against the stone. Clack, clack, clack. Every step sounded like a death knell. He did not look at the fawning lords. He did not acknowledge the curtsying ladies who were desperately trying to catch his eye despite their terror. He was tracking something. Alistair's ice-blue eyes swept the room. His nostrils flared slightly, taking in the chaotic symphony of scents. Fear, roasted meat, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else. Something that had halted him outside the keep's walls. A scent he hadn't realized he was starving for until it hit him. It smelled of rain-washed pine, crushed winter berries, and profound, agonizing sorrow. It was the scent of a severed mate bond. But beneath that tragedy lay an underlying fragrance so intoxicating, so impossibly rare, that the direwolf pacing inside his chest, a beast that had slumbered in cold apathy for a decade, hurled itself against the bars of his ribcage, roaring in sudden, violent possession. Alistair followed the scent, his broad shoulders parting the sea of cowering nobility, until he reached the center of the hall. He stopped at the edge of the blood-stained rushes. He looked down. There, kneeling in the dirt amid the ruined remnants of her midnight blue gown and the hacked-off locks of her dark hair, was a fragile, trembling, human-looking girl. She was bleeding from a scrape on her elbow, her breathing shallow, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance as she looked up at him. She was tiny compared to him, fragile, broken, and she was the source of the scent. Silence stretched in the great hall, thick and elastic, ready to snap. The Alpha King stood over the disgraced, unshifted runt of House Hastings. On the dais, Cedric Ashbourne finally found his voice, a desperate, trembling thing. He misread the situation entirely, assuming the king had stopped to inspect the trash sullying his royal path. "Your Grace," Cedric stammered, keeping his head bowed but raising his voice. "Forgive the interruption of your royal progress. This creature on the floor is Genevieve Hastings. She is an unshifted runt, a blight on our kind. I have just rejected her to keep the Ashbourne bloodline pure. My guards will clear her from your sight at once." Alistair did not look at Cedric. His glowing, ice-blue eyes remained locked on Genevieve, mapping every tear on her cheek, every ragged edge of her torn dress, the severed hair that lay scattered around her knees like fallen leaves. "You rejected her." Alistair's voice was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a voice that commanded armies and broke kings. "Yes, my king," Cedric said, puffing out his chest slightly, proud of his ruthless adherence to the old laws. "She is barren, unworthy." Alistair's head turned slowly toward the dais. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Frost literally began to creep along the edges of the stone hearth. "Unworthy," Alistair repeated. The word sounded foreign in his mouth, laced with a sudden, lethal calm that made Sir Thomas, his guard captain, instinctively rest his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "She is, your Grace." "She has no wolf," Cedric agreed eagerly, standing up slightly from his bow, emboldened by what he thought was the king's agreement. In a blur of motion too fast for the naked eye to track, Alistair vanished from his spot. A heartbeat later, a sickening crash echoed through the hall. Cedric Ashbourne was no longer standing. The Alpha King had him pinned by the throat against the ancient tapestries on the far wall, 3 feet off the ground. Alistair's massive, gauntleted hand wrapped entirely around Cedric's thick neck, crushing the windpipe. Cedric thrashed, his eyes bulging, his legs kicking uselessly in the air. "You dare," Alistair snarled, the sound layering with the guttural, demonic double timbre of his direwolf, "brand what is mine as unworthy." The collective gasp that tore through the great hall was one of unadulterated horror. Baron Godfrey actually fainted, collapsing into a heap of expensive velvet. Lady Evelyn clutched a pillar, her face drained of all color, staring at the king in absolute mind-shattering disbelief. Genevieve remained frozen on the floor, her heart stopping in her chest. "What is mine?" The words echoed in her mind, making no sense. Alistair held Cedric effortlessly, his grip tightening as the Ashbourne heir began to claw frantically at the king's unyielding arm. "Your Grace," Cedric choked out, spittle flying from his lips. She is dormant. A runt. Alistair said, his voice dropping into a deadly, whispering register that carried perfectly in the dead silence, "is your queen, and you have dared to draw her blood, sever her hair, and cast her into the dirt." With a flick of his wrist, Alistair threw the massive alpha across the dais. Cedric crashed violently into the heavy oak high table, splintering it in two, before crumpling into a broken, groaning heap of blood and wood. The Alpha King turned his back on the ruined lord and stepped slowly down the stairs of the dais. He walked back to where Genevieve knelt. The royal guards formed a seamless ring of steel and shadow around them, blocking out the stares of the horrified nobility. Alistair sank to one knee, the heavy fur of his cloak spilling over the dirty rushes. Up close, Genevieve could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his harsh face, the ancient loneliness behind his glowing blue eyes. He reached out with a large, heavily calloused hand. He didn't grab her with the rough dominance Cedric had used. His touch was painstakingly gentle, as if he were handling a creature made of spun glass. His long fingers brushed against her cheek, wiping away a streak of dirt and a single fallen tear. The moment his skin made contact with hers, a jolt of electricity, pure, searing, and impossibly bright, shot through Genevieve's entire body. She gasped, arching her back. It felt as though a star had just ignited in her chest. The darkness, the cold, the void where her wolf was supposed to reside suddenly shattered. For 20 years she had been told she was empty, but as the king's aura bled into her veins, she realized she wasn't empty at all. Her wolf hadn't been dead. It had been buried in an ancient, enchanted slumber, waiting for a key powerful enough to unlock it. It required the aura of a royal direwolf. Alistair's eyes widened a fraction as he felt it too. The undeniable, soul-deep click of the mate bond snapping into place, locking their souls together with the force of a tectonic shift. "There you are," Alistair murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion, leaning in until his breath brushed her ear. "My little wolf." Genevieve trembled violently, her hands coming up to grip his armored forearms to steady herself. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't shift. I have no wolf. They said I am cursed." "They are fools," Alistair replied softly, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Blind, arrogant fools who have forgotten the old histories. You are not dormant because you are weak, Genevieve. You are dormant because your bloodline predates theirs by 1,000 years." He stood up, towering over her, and effortlessly scooped her into his arms. He lifted her against his broad chest, as if she weighed no more than a feather. Genevieve instinctively buried her face into the crook of his neck, breathing in the intoxicating scent of freezing rain and cedar. The safety she felt in his arms was absolute, a stark contrast to the terror of the past decade. Alistair turned to face the cowering court. The nobles of Somerset Keep were trembling, their eyes glued to the small, disgraced girl now cradled against the king's chest. "Look closely," Alistair commanded, his voice echoing with unquestionable authority. Genevieve, bolstered by the king's immense strength, slowly lifted her head. She opened her eyes to look at her tormentors, but the room looked different. The dim candlelight was blindingly bright. She could hear the frantic heartbeats of every lord and lady in the room. She could smell their terror. Lady Beatrice screamed, stumbling backward. High Cleric Reginald dropped to his knees, making the holy sign of the moon across his chest. Genevieve couldn't see her own reflection, but she didn't need to. The reaction of the crowd told her everything. Her human hazel eyes were gone. In their place burned a pair of luminescent, pure silver irises. It was a color that hadn't been seen in Ethelgard since the dawn of the first Pax, the mark of the White Wolves, the queens of antiquity. Cedric Ashbourne, coughing up blood from the wreckage of the table, lifted his head. His eyes met Genevieve's glowing silver gaze, and a look of absolute, soul-crushing horror dawned on his face. He hadn't just rejected a weakling, he had thrown away a mythological rarity, a female whose blood held the power to elevate a pack to absolute supremacy. "Lord Ashbourne," King Alistair said, his tone chillingly conversational, "you have done me a great service tonight. By severing your petty contract, you have spared me the trouble of cutting you down to claim what fate has ordained as mine." The king adjusted Genevieve in his arms, wrapping his heavy winter cloak around her shivering shoulders, entirely covering her torn dress and hiding her from the lustful, terrified eyes of the court. "Genevieve Hastings is no longer of this territory," Alistair announced, glaring at Baron Godfrey, who whimpered under the royal gaze. "She is the Queen of the United Realms. And if any wolf in this hall speaks her name without bowing their head, I will return to Somerset, and I will burn this keep to the ground with all of you inside." He didn't wait for a response. The king turned on his heel and strode back down the aisle of rushes, carrying Genevieve toward the blasted open doors. Sir Thomas and the royal guard immediately fell into formation around them, their armor clanking in unison. As they stepped out of the suffocating heat of the great hall and into the biting winter wind of the courtyard, Genevieve tightened her grip on Alistair's tunic. The royal carriage, a massive conveyance of blackened wood and iron drawn by 6 massive midnight draft horses, awaited them. "Where are we going?" Genevieve whispered, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her, her eyelids heavy. Alistair looked down at her, the harshness in his face melting into something entirely possessive and fiercely protective. "Home, Genevieve, to the north, where no one will ever dare lay a hand on you again." He placed her gently inside the fur-lined carriage, climbing in after her. As the doors slammed shut and the carriage lurched forward, leaving the disgraced Ashbourne clan and her cruel family behind in the dust, Genevieve realized her life wasn't over. It had just violently, beautifully begun. The journey to Oakhaven took 3 grueling weeks, a relentless march through frozen tundras and biting blizzards that would have killed a normal human. But Genevieve was no longer entirely human. Since the moment King Alistair's skin had touched hers in the Great Hall of Somerset, a frantic, thrumming heat had nested beneath her ribs. Her eyes, once a dull hazel, remained a brilliant, glowing silver. She could see perfectly in the pitch black of the carriage. She could hear the crunch of the massive draft horses' hooves a mile ahead and the murmurs of the royal guard riding flank. Yet, the wolf inside her refused to surface. It paced in the shadowy confines of her mind, heavy and restless. But the physical shift, the snapping of bone and reshaping of flesh eluded her. When the jagged, black stone spires of Oakhaven Keep finally pierced the heavy winter fog, Genevieve felt a wave of profound intimidation. This was not the manicured, tapestry-draped castle of her uncle. Oakhaven was a war fortress. It was carved directly into the side of the Frostfang Mountains, a monument to the harsh, unforgiving nature of the northern packs. As the carriage rumbled into the vast courtyard, hundreds of northern wolves stood at attention. There was no velvet here, no silk or fawning courtiers. The men and women of the north wore heavy pelts, boiled leather, and chainmail. Their faces were weathered by frost and war. When King Alistair stepped out of the carriage, his midnight wolf fur cloak billowing behind him, the entire courtyard dropped to one knee in a wave of silent, absolute loyalty. Alistair turned and offered his hand. Genevieve took it, stepping out into the biting wind. A collective inhale swept through the courtyard as the northern pack laid eyes on her. They saw her fragile frame, her lack of battle scars, and the oversized fur cloak swallowing her small shoulders. But then, she lifted her chin. The blinding silver of her eyes cut through the gloom like twin moons. Whispers erupted immediately, frantic and reverent. "The white blood," an old warrior murmured, tracing the sign of the goddess over his chest. But not all whispers were rooted in awe. From the shadows of the main keep, Lady Vivian, the fiercely ambitious daughter of the commander of the northern armies, watched with narrowed amber eyes. For years, Vivian had positioned herself as the only logical choice for Alistair's mate. Seeing the Alpha King carefully escort a tiny, unshifted southern girl up the stone steps sent a venomous surge of jealousy through her veins. That evening, the great hall of Oakhaven was tense. A war council had been convened. Alistair sat at the head of a massive slate table, Genevieve seated at his right hand. The warmth radiating from his massive shoulder was her only anchor in the room full of hostile, assessing glares. Earl Harold of the Southern Valleys has called his banners, "Your Grace, General Kalin," a towering brute of a man with half his face heavily scarred, reported grimly. His son, Cedric, lies in a healer's bed with a crushed windpipe and a shattered spine. Harold claims you broke the ancient treaties by assaulting a high lord and stealing his son's rightful, legally bound mate. Alistair's laugh was a dark, hollow sound that made the torches flicker. Rightful mate? The boy publicly rejected her and cast her into the dirt. I merely claimed the treasure he was too blind to recognize. He reached out beneath the heavy oak table, his large hand enveloping Genevieve's trembling fingers. His thumb stroked her knuckles in a slow, soothing rhythm, a stark contrast to the violence in his voice. If Harold wants a war, I will bury him beneath the snow. With respect, my king, Lady Vivienne interrupted, stepping out from the circle of advisors. She cast a disdainful look at Genevieve. We will gladly march for you. We will bleed for Oakhaven, but the southern lords are using her lack of a wolf as propaganda. They are whispering that our king has been bewitched by a dormant runt, that you have brought weakness into the heart of the north. She has the silver eyes of the ancients, yes, but eyes do not win wars. Fangs do. Genevieve stiffened, pulling her hand from Alistair's grip. The sting of Vivienne's words was sharp, because they echoed her own internal fears. She was a queen in name, but without a wolf, she was a liability to the very man who had saved her. Alistair stood, his chair scraping violently against the stone. The sheer, crushing weight of his alpha aura slammed into the room, driving General Kaelin and Lady Vivienne to their knees in an instant. The stone table cracked under the pressure. You forget yourself, Vivienne, Alistair snarled, his eyes bleeding from ice blue to the demonic, glowing black of his dire wolf. You speak to your queen. Her worth is not measured by your narrow understanding of power. Speak of her as a liability again, and I will rip your tongue from your skull. Alistair, stop, Genevieve said. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the oppressive aura like a silver blade. To the utter shock of the War Council, Alistair immediately pulled his aura back. The monstrous king turned to her, the murderous rage in his face softening into something painfully devoted. Genevieve stood up. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she refused to cower. She looked down at the kneeling Lady Vivienne, then at General Kaelin. You demand proof of my strength, Genevieve said, her voice steadying as the ancient heat in her blood began to boil. You fear that I am a dormant burden who will drag your king into a losing war. We require a queen who can lead the pack, my lady, General Kaelin grunted, struggling to his feet now that the king's pressure had receded. When the king is away on the battlefield, the queen must hold the keep. A human cannot hold Oakhaven. Then let us put the whispers to rest, Genevieve declared, looking directly at Alistair. I will not have your kingdom divided because they doubt me. Alistair stepped close to her, his brow furrowed. Genevieve, you do not need to prove anything to these fools. You are mine. That is enough. It is not enough for me, she whispered fiercely, looking up into his scarred face. I will not be a captive bird in a golden cage, Alistair. I will be your equal. The challenge was set for the courtyard under the light of the full moon. The entire population of Oakhaven Keep had gathered, standing atop the battlements and lining the frost-covered walls. The air was bitterly cold, so frigid it burned the lungs, but the atmosphere was thick with bloodlust and anticipation. Lord Ewan of the Crag, one of Vivienne's most loyal traditionalists, had volunteered to test the new queen. He was a massive, battle-hardened alpha, known for his cruelty and his unyielding adherence to the old ways. He stood in the center of the snow-covered courtyard, already stripped of his armor, his muscles twitching as his inner beast demanded release. Genevieve stood opposite him, 20 paces away. She had discarded the heavy fur cloak, wearing only a simple, reinforced leather tunic and breeches. She was shivering, her breath pluming in the icy air, but her silver eyes were fixed on Ewan with unnatural calm. Alistair stood on the stone balcony overlooking the courtyard, flanked by his royal guards. His hands gripped the stone balustrade so hard, the rock was crumbling beneath his gauntlets. Every instinct in his dire wolf screamed to leap down, slaughter Lord Ewan, and carry his mate back to the safety of their chambers. But he held back. He understood the raw, desperate need in Genevieve's soul to erase the shame of her past. She needed this victory. Are you prepared to yield, Southern girl? Lord Ewan taunted, his bones cracking as his spine began to lengthen, the monstrous transformation beginning. I will try not to mar your pretty face before I force you to submit, With a sickening crunch, Ewan dropped to all fours. Brown fur erupted from his skin, and within seconds, a massive timber wolf the size of a warhorse stood in the snow, slavering and snarling, its yellow eyes fixed on Genevieve. The crowd held its breath. Genevieve closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the pressure in her chest. She stopped fearing the beast that had slumbered in the dark for 20 years. Instead, she reached inward, grasping the tether of the bond she shared with Alistair, pulling his immense strength into her own soul. "Wake up," she commanded the creature within her. "Wake up and claim your crown." A sound tore from Genevieve's throat, a guttural, echoing scream that morphed halfway into a bone-rattling howl. The transformation did not come with the grotesque, fleshy tearing of normal wolves. It was an explosion of pure, blinding moonlight. A shockwave of silver energy blasted outward from her body, throwing the front row of spectators off their feet and sending Lord Ewan's massive brown wolf skidding backward in the snow. Alistair gasped, his eyes widening in pure awe. When the blinding light faded, Genevieve, the fragile human, was gone. In her place stood a creature of myth. She was a magnificent, impossibly large wolf, standing shoulder to shoulder with the height of a direwolf. Her fur was a flawless, pearlescent white that seemed to weave the very moonlight into its strands. She had no scars, no imperfections. She was elegance and lethal power combined, and her eyes burned like liquid silver stars. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop howling. Lord Ewan's beast recovered, shaking its heavy head. Driven by alpha pride and sheer instinct, he snarled and lunged at the white wolf, his massive jaws aiming for her throat. Genevieve moved with a speed that defied logic. She didn't dodge. She met him head-on. With a deafening roar that sounded like crushing glaciers, the White Queen struck. She collided with the heavy timber wolf midair, batting him aside with a single, devastating swipe of her massive paw. Ewan crashed into the stone wall of the keep, whimpering in pain. Before he could regain his footing, Genevieve was upon him. She did not tear his throat out, though she easily could have. Instead, she planted one massive white paw squarely on his chest, pinning the huge alpha to the frozen ground, and bared fangs that gleamed like polished steel. She released an aura so ancient, so pure and dominant, that it forced every wolf in the courtyard to their knees. It wasn't a demand for submission through terror, like Alistair's aura. It was a demand for reverence. Beneath her paw, Lord Ewan whined, exposing his neck entirely, surrendering to his absolute superior. Genevieve lifted her head to the sky and let out a howl. It was a haunting, beautiful, terrifying sound that echoed across the jagged peaks of the Frost Fangs, announcing to the gods, to the northern lords, and to the rebellious southern armies that the White Queen had returned to Ethelgard. From the balcony, a darker, far more violent howl answered hers. King Alistair threw himself over the stone balustrade. He shifted in mid-air, landing in the snow not as a man, but as a colossal, scarred dire wolf, his fur as black as the void, his eyes burning with icy blue fire. The ground shook as the King of the North padded slowly toward his queen. The black dire wolf and the white wolf met in the center of the courtyard. Alistair lowered his massive, terrifying head, respectfully nudging his muzzle against Genevieve's silver-white cheek in a public display of utter devotion. Genevieve leaned into his touch, her tail sweeping the snow, the bond between them locking into a permanent, unbreakable fortress of power. Lady Vivian, trembling in the snow, bowed her head until her forehead touched the ice. General Kalen thumped his fist against his chest in a warrior's salute, tears freezing on his scarred cheeks. They had doubted her. They had called her unworthy. But as Genevieve stood victorious in the snow, bathed in moonlight beside her monstrous king, she knew the truth. Cedric Ashbourne had not discarded a runt. He had unwittingly unleashed a goddess. And when the southern armies finally marched on Oakhaven, they would not find a fragile girl waiting for them. They would find the White Queen of the North, and they would burn in her silver fire. The White Queen has finally awakened, and the North will never be the same. Genevieve's epic transformation from a disgraced runt to the most powerful female in Ethelgard proves that true strength lies in resilience. But with Earl Harold's southern army marching toward Oakhaven, a brutal war of alphas is inevitable. Will King Alistair and Queen Genevieve's new bond survive the coming bloodshed? Hit that like button, share with your fellow wolves, and subscribe for the explosive finale.